The Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Investment will come to order. Welcome, everyone. I note that a quorum is present. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on protecting students and taxpayers, improving the closed school discharge process. This is an entirely remote hearing. All microphones will be kept muted as a general rule to avoid unnecessary background noise. Members and witnesses will be responsible for unmuting themselves when they are recognized to speak or when they wish to seek recognition. I also ask that members please identify themselves before they speak. Members should keep their cameras on while in the proceedings. Members shall be considered present in the proceedings when they are visible on camera, and they shall be considered not present when they are not visible on camera. The only exception to this, if they are experiencing technical difficulty, and inform committee staff of such difficulty. If any member experiences technical difficulties during the hearing, you should stay connected on the platform. Make sure you are muted and use your phone to immediately call the committee's IT director, whose number was provided in advance. Should the chair experience technical difficulties or need to step away to vote on the floor, Representative Bonamici, thank you, Ms. Bonamici, as a member of the subcommittee or another majority member of the subcommittee is not available, is hereby authorized to assume the gavel in the chair's absence. This is an entirely remote hearing, and as such, the committee's hearing room was officially closed. Members who choose to sit with their individual devices in the hearing room must wear headphones to avoid feedback, echoes, and distortion resulting from more than one person on the software platform sitting in the same room. Members are also expected to adhere to social distancing and safe health care guidelines, including the use of masks, hand sanitizer, and wiping down their areas both before and after their presence in the hearing room. In order to ensure that the committee's 5-minute rule is adhered to, staff will be keeping track of time using the committee's digital timer, which appears as in its own thumbnail picture. Members and witnesses are asked to wrap up promptly when their time has expired. Pursuant to Committee 8C, opening statements are limited to the chair and the ranking member. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and provide all members with adequate time to ask questions. I now recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Today, we're meeting to discuss ways to improve the closed school discharge program, which provides relief to students when their institution abruptly closes. This discussion will focus on new preliminary findings from a Government Accountability Office study that will be presented to the committee this morning. In the last decade, at least 5 large for-profit college chains have collapsed overnight, leaving tens of thousands of students with significant student loan debt and often without degrees. These school closures can be devastating for students, plunging them into financial and emotional despair while robbing them of the education and opportunities they deserve. To support these students, Congress included a closed student discharge provision in the Higher Education Act. Under current law, affected students have 3 options. Number 1, continue pursuing their degree either through a teach out plan offered by their own institution or through agreements with other institutions. Number 2, transfer to another institution of their choice. Or 3, apply for a discharge of their federal student loans. Unfortunately, the first 2 options are fraught with challenges. Many institutions will not accept credits earned at defunct schools, and institutions that do participate in teach-out plans or accept credits are often very low quality. In fact, in 2017, GAO found that students who transferred their credits from for-profit schools to public schools lost 94% of their credits. For students applying for a full discharge of their federal student loan is often the best option because it both reduces their financial burden and restores their eligibility for federal student aid. The closed school discharge process should be simple to understand and easy to navigate for students. The GAO's findings showed that this is not the case, as we'll hear today. There are three key problems that the Education Department must solve. First, many students do not become aware that they're entitled to loan relief until they have already damaged their credit through delinquency and default. It is critical that affected students receive more timely information about the process for applying for closed school discharge. One way to address this challenge is to restore the automatic school discharge process that was implemented under the Obama administration. This process streamlined relief for affected students without forcing them to submit information that the Education Department already has. Unfortunately, the Trump administration under Betsy DeVos eliminated this program. The Education Department also could reduce the 3-year waiting period that student borrowers must endure before their loans are fully discharged. Second, students who experience a school closure often do not go on to complete their degrees at another institution. The teach-out options that defunct schools are required to provide their students often funnel them into other low-quality schools. The Education Department should address this challenge by conducting greater oversight over teach-out plans and other agreements between institutions. And finally, the GAO's preliminary finding once again demonstrate that low-quality for-profit schools are costing students and taxpayers billions of dollars. 96% of the students who received closed school discharges between 2010 and 2020 attended for-profit schools. I'll say that again. 96% of the students who received closed school discharges between 2010 and 2020 attended for-profit schools. Congress and the Education Department must work together to crack down on predatory schools that continue to cheat our students and our taxpayers. The challenges described in the GAO's preliminary findings are important and extremely timely. In the next 2 weeks, the Education Department will begin considering changes to the closed school discharge process. I hope the rulemaking committees will closely review the lessons that can be learned from the GAO's report. I want to thank the GAO and all of our witnesses for being with us today. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member for the purpose of making an opening statement. Representative Murphy.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. When a college class closes, thousands of students are thrown off their academic path, some permanently. This often leaves students that are left with tens of thousands of dollars in debt and no degree to show for it. Without credentials, it is exponentially more difficult for these students to repay their loans. They are thus left in a worse place than when they started their degree. This is simply not right. These students deserve protections and should not face the full financial burden of student loan debt if their school's closure forced them to end their education abruptly. In the best case scenario, when a school closes, students should have the option to continue their program at another college. Students have already invested time and money into starting the degree, and it would be unfortunate to see this effort go to waste. Finishing their programs would be a far greater benefit for students in the long term, really, than just forgiving their loan. Simply discharging students' debt without providing every avenue possible to degree completion leave taxpayers bearing an unnecessary burden. This is simply not a reasonable pathway, nor is it right for an administration to use its narrow authority to grossly abuse the closed school discharge program. In August, the Biden administration announced that it was expanding the, quote, look back window, quote, to students who attended ITT Tech in 2008, a full 8 years before it closed. This will cost taxpayers over $1 billion. This policy is simply reckless and financially honestly absurd. It is clear that the Biden administration is using this narrow program as a Trojan horse for the Democrats' radical mass student loan forgiveness agenda. We must resist these efforts if we're ever to get our nation's financial house in order. The money simply does not grow on trees. Education is an investment, and all investments have inherent risks. We need to get back to the belief in this country that personal responsibility means something. Everything is not free when faced with adverse circumstances. While no student, however, should be left holding the bag if their school preemptively closes, we should ensure that schools receiving federal financial dollars are financially viable rather than cleaning up the mess after they've closed. This topic is just one of many that we should be discussing in the context of a higher and full reform of the Higher Education Act. If we're serious about addressing this issue, I urge the committee that we work together in a bipartisan manner, which we can do, to adequately legislate. The pandemic exposed some significant flaws with our country's higher educational system. Our country's college students deserve better from their institutions. When discussing such reforms, it is critical that we balance the interests of hardworking taxpayers with those of student borrowers. It is difficult to explain to a hardworking American that never went to college why he or she would have to pay off someone else's student loan. Blue-collar Americans have struggled the most throughout this pandemic. Many losing their jobs are being told they aren't allowed to show up for work. And while these Americans now are being asked to pay for white-collar degrees, that is simply not right. Degree completion is a student's best bet for a successful future. This should be our focus, not burdening taxpayers with debt that is neither their fault nor their responsibility. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I look forward to an excellent subcommittee meeting, and I appreciate the time to speak. I yield back.
Thank you. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5:00 p.m. on Thursday, October 14, 2021. I will now introduce the witnesses, and thank you so much for coming today. Our first witness is Melissa Emery Harris, who is a director of GAO's Education Workforce and Income Security Team. She oversees GAO's higher education work. Prior to joining GAO, she worked as a private sector consulting company, conducted program evaluations for state and local governments, and worked in nonprofit agencies serving children and families. Melissa earned a master's degree in public policy from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree from Swarthmore College. Welcome, Melissa. Our second witness is Karen Rhodes, who is a mother, grandmother, entrepreneur, and real estate agent from Torrance, California. In 1988, as a single mother, Ms. Rhodes took out $6,625 in federal student loans to enroll in a data entry program at American Business Institute, ABI, which suddenly closed 7 months into Ms. Rhodes' education. Ms. Rhodes has never been informed about her right to a closed school discharge, but eventually had her loans discharged in August of 2020. Our third witness is Preston Cooper, who is a research fellow at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, a nonpartisan nonprofit think tank focused on bringing opportunity to those who least have it. Mr. Cooper's work focuses on the federal student loan program and the economics of higher education. He is also a regular contributor to Forbes. Mr. Cooper holds a bachelor's degree from Swarthmont College and a master's degree in economics from George Mason University. Welcome. And last, we will hear from Robin Smith, who currently works as a senior attorney with the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, where she concentrates on student loan and for-profit school issues. She also acts as of counsel with the National Consumer Law Center, where she co-authored NCLC's student loan law treatise. Mrs. Smith also worked as a supervising deputy attorney general at the California Attorney General's office, where she investigated and prosecuted fraudulent for-profit colleges. Lastly, she has authored a report on the Department of Education's existing authority to provide widespread discharges to borrowers impacted by student loan closures. Welcome. We appreciate the witnesses for participating today, and we all look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements and they will appear in full in the hearing record pursuant to Committee Rule 8D and committee practice. Each of you is asked to limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. Before you begin your testimony, please remember to unmute your microphone. During your testimony, staff will be keeping track of time and a timer will sound when your time is up. Please be attentive to the time. Wrap up when your time is over and re-mute your microphone. If any of you experience technical difficulties during your testimony or late in the hearing, you should say, do not disconnect, stay on the platform, make sure you are muted and use your phone to immediately call the committee's IT director, whose number was provided to you in advance. We will let all the witnesses make their presentations before we move to member questions. When answering a question, please remember to unmute your microphone. I will first recognize Miss Emery Aris. That's it.
You got it.
Our testimony. Good morning.
Good morning, Chairwoman Wilson, Republican Leader Murphy, Chairman Scott, Republican Leader Fox, and members of the subcommittee. I am pleased to be here today to discuss GAO's work on closed school discharges. When a college closes, it can derail the education of many students, leaving them with loans but no degree. Those who cannot complete their education may be eligible to have their federal student loans forgiven through a closed school discharge from the Department of Education. I will focus my remarks on GAO's research findings in 2 areas. 1, what is known about borrowers who were enrolled in colleges that closed, and 2, the extent to which these borrowers received closed school discharges. Beginning with a look at the borrowers who were enrolled at schools that closed, we found that about 246,000 federal student loan borrowers were enrolled at over 1,100 colleges that closed from 2010 through 2020. We also found that 86% of these borrowers were enrolled at for-profit colleges that closed. While some students at closed schools managed to complete their programs or transfer, including some students who transferred to another college that also subsequently closed, we found that many of the borrowers enrolled at closed schools did not complete their program or transfer making them eligible for a closed school discharge. Specifically, we found that over 40% of impacted borrowers did not complete their program before their college closed or transfer to another college, showing that closures are often the end of the road for a student's education. Next, turning to GAO's research findings on closed school discharges, we found that over 80,000 borrowers had their federal student loans forgiven through the closed school discharge process. The majority of these borrowers applied for loan forgiveness. However, over 27,000 received relief through a process that took effect in 2018, which automatically discharged loans for eligible borrowers. The automatic process discharges loans for eligible borrowers 3 years after a closure and helps those who have not applied for a loan discharge. According to education officials, some of these borrowers may not have been aware that they were eligible for loan discharges. Automatic discharges have accounted for at least 42% of discharges since borrowers became eligible for them. The automatic discharge process has provided relief to many borrowers struggling to repay their loans. About 73% of borrowers who eventually received automatic discharges faced difficulty repaying their loans. Specifically, 52% of these borrowers defaulted on their loans, and an additional 21% were past due on their loans by 90 days or more at some point during repayment. More than half of the borrowers who fell into default before receiving an automatic discharge did so within a year and a half of their college closing. Since education processes discharges 3 years after a closure, many borrowers who receive these automatic discharges were facing the consequences of default for a substantial amount of time before receiving the automatic discharge. Borrowers who eventually received automatic discharges faced higher rates of default than other borrowers. For instance, borrowers receiving automatic discharges defaulted at about 5 times the national average and about 9 times the rate of those who applied for and received discharges. Although many borrowers were at risk of facing severe financial burdens from their federal student loans that were past due or in default, they did not apply for a discharge. Borrowers in default may be subject to wage garnishment or reductions in income tax refunds and some Social Security benefits. Defaulted loans and loans past due for 90 days or more will also appear on the borrower's credit record, which may make it more difficult for them to obtain their other loans and can also harm their ability to obtain a job or rent or buy a home. Many borrowers who were struggling to repay their loans eventually received relief through the automatic process. Since education eliminated the process, borrowers impacted by future closures will have to apply to receive a discharge. Those who do not apply, potentially because they are not aware of their eligibility, may face long-term financial burdens from student loans that are past due or in default, even though those loans are eligible to be discharged. This completes my statement, and I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Rhodes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Karen Rhodes, and I live in Torrance, California. I'm a wife, mother, grandmother, and now a self-made entrepreneur. I would like to share this testimony of my 30-year-long journey with the Department of Education to get a closed school loan discharge. My goal is to help anyone who is experiencing or has experienced a defaulted school loan as a result of a school closure. In 1988, I was a single mother who worked for Comcast as a customer service representative. In this position, I was struggling financially. I wanted to provide a better life for my daughter, so I decided to try to become a data entry clerk. This position required a degree, and I discovered that American Business Institute in Los Angeles offered this course. I made an appointment to tour the school. After the tour, I enrolled and took out $6,625 in federal student loans. I officially started school in April 1988 and attended classes while balancing my job and taking care of my daughter. 7 months later, while trying to attend one of my night classes, several other students and I were stopped by the police from entering the school premises and were told there will not be any classes today. The police told us they could not give us any information, but they stated that there was an open investigation with the school and asked us to leave. The following week, I called the school multiple times and left voicemails for all the employees listed on the school's website, but with no answer. I decided to drive to the school in hopes of reaching one of the faculty members. Once I arrived, I saw other students had showed up to the school as well. All we saw was a note taped to the school's main door stating that the school was closed. No other information was listed. One student informed me that the owners of the school had committed fraud and were indicted. I was stunned. Week after week, I kept calling and stopping by, but nothing changed. I also reached out to other school branches, but I received no assistance. I then understood I was on my own and stuck with the debt from a school that was now closed. In the first few years after the school closed, I told the people who were collecting my student loans about the closure and asked for my loan to be canceled because I never received my degree. However, my requests were denied because at that time, Congress had not created a closed school discharge process. For almost 3 decades, I struggled to make my student loan payments and eventually defaulted. During that time, I was a junior operator at a hair salon while attending cosmetology school, and my husband was the main provider for our family. Although, according to my legal aid lawyer, I was eligible for this discharge since 1994, I had never been invited to apply by my loan servicer or debt collectors, even when I explained that my school had closed. The Department of Education obtained a judgment against me in federal court and seized $2,100 in federal income tax refunds. I was confused why my tax returns were seized because I had no knowledge of the judgment. I was never served nor received any paperwork and did not have any legal representation. Due to the judgment, I was not eligible for stopping the tax refund offsets through consideration or rehabilitation. This also prevented me from going back to school because I would never be able to secure any federal funding when I had a defaulted loan on my credit. This caused me tremendous stress, and I felt the education system had failed me. In October 2018, I received a letter attempting to collect on my school loan. It stated that my original $6,625 loan had ballooned to a $26,000 debt. I was informed that I need to make payments on the loan or else they would pursue wage garnishments against me. I agreed to start making $60 monthly payments to protect my family and our wages while I continued to pursue a school loan discharge. I researched on the internet and found that there was a class action suit against American Business Institute, so I called and spoke with Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, explaining my situation. On December 13, 2018, Legal Aid assisted me by submitting a closed school discharge application. On December 21st, my application was denied. In August 2020, Legal Aid submitted an appeal. A few weeks later, I received a letter stating that I was granted my closed school discharge. I was so excited and relieved that I finally was free of that $26,000 debt. I was also refunded the $2,100 that was taken in income tax refunds. Legal Aid also succeeded in having the judgment removed from my credit as well as the lawsuit dismissed with prejudice. This was the icing on the cake for me and a day to remember. I was overjoyed that it was finally over after almost 30 years. I felt vindicated and that the truth had prevailed in the end. I'm glad my God never let me give up. He led me to the right people to help me, and they were at Legal Aid of Los Angeles. Thank you for this opportunity to share my story, and thank you, Chairwoman Wilson, Ranking Member Murphy, and members of the committee for this opportunity to share my experiences.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll now hear from Mr. Cooper.
Good morning, Chairwoman Wilson, Ranking Member Murphy, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on improving the closed school discharge process. My name is Preston Cooper, and I am a research fellow in higher education policy at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank focused on bringing opportunity to people with incomes below the U.S. median. My remarks today are my own and do not represent the views of my employer. Closed school discharges are an important feature of the student loan safety net, but policymakers should view them as a last resort. Students affected by school closures did not originally go to college with the intention of taking out loans that would later be discharged. They went to college in order to earn a degree or certificate and build a better life for themselves. When schools close, we want students to complete their programs through a teach-out or transfer their credits to another university and earn a credential there. This will make them ineligible for a discharge, but they will get what they originally wanted, a degree. Closed school discharges should be the last option we consider, not the first. When they occur, it means we have failed students. The problem is not that schools sometimes close. School closures will always be a fact of life. In fact, creative destruction in higher education is desirable. If schools never closed, it would be a sign of stagnation in higher education. The challenge is not preventing school closures, but managing them to ensure students can complete their education elsewhere and do not impose excessive burdens on taxpayers through the closed school discharge process. Institutions can sometimes shut down with little warning, leaving students scrambling to complete their education. The Department of Education's track record of predicting school closures ahead of time is poor. The key metric it uses to assess schools' financial health once suggested that a school for hypnotists is in better shape than Harvard University financially. Institutions such as Corinthian colleges have found ways to manipulate financial responsibility metrics and limit the department's ability to take action to protect students and taxpayers. The private sector has often proven better than the Department of Education at assessing the true state of institutions' financial health. According to the GAO, in 2016, private credit rating agencies gave junk bond status to 30 colleges that received a clean bill of financial health from the Department of Education. To that end, Congress should leverage the power of the private sector to help the department predict when schools will close and provide the financial incentives for schools to shut themselves down in an orderly fashion. The solution is to require schools to purchase insurance to cover the costs associated with closed school discharges. Each year, the Department of Education would calculate taxpayers' total potential liability in the event of a school closure. Aid-dependent schools would then be required to purchase insurance on the private market to fully cover those potential losses. If the school fails and closed school discharges are granted, the insurance company would make taxpayers whole. The key benefit is that insurance companies could vary institutions' premiums according to the financial risk each school presents. Institutions on stronger financial footing would pay lower premiums. Schools with a well-defined teach-out plan and articulation agreements with other colleges to ensure transferability of credit would also get a break on their premiums. But unscrupulous institutions such as Corinthian colleges might not be able to secure insurance coverage at all. The insurance mandate creates a direct financial incentive for institutions to serve students better. There is ample precedent for insurance mandates. Car owners must purchase insurance, as must homeowners if they want to get a mortgage. It's not unreasonable to ask colleges and universities, which receive taxpayer funding in excess of $100 billion every single year, to meet the same standard as ordinary people. The best way to serve students is not to grant as many closed school discharges as possible, but to make closed school discharges unnecessary. Students take on debt because they want a degree or certificate. Schools need incentives to maximize their students' chances of earning that credential, even in the event of a school closure. An insurance mandate for higher education can provide those incentives while protecting taxpayers at the same time. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll now hear from Ms. Smith.
Chairwoman Wilson, Ranking Member Murphy, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today about improving the federal loan discharge process for borrowers harmed by sudden school closures. I offer my testimony on behalf of the low-income clients of the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles and the National Consumer Law Center. Legal services organizations have long witnessed the suffering endured by federal student loan borrowers after their school has abruptly closed. At least since 1986, thousands of for-profit schools have closed, leaving hundreds of thousands of low-income students with student debt that they have been unable to repay through no fault of their own. In 1992, after Senate subcommittee hearings revealed the extensive harm caused by school closures, Congress amended the Higher Education Act to mandate that the department grant loan discharges to borrowers who are unable to complete their education due to school closure. Congress applied the mandate retroactively to students whose schools closed after January 1st of 1986. The department's closed school regulations, published in 1994, provide discretion to the department to grant automatic discharges to borrowers who are eligible based on information in its possession. Instead of using this authority to grant retroactive automatic discharges to borrowers harmed by school closures between 1986 and the present, The department has required students to submit applications, even though students remain unaware that a closed school discharge is even an option. Although the department recently used this automatic discharge authority for some ITT tech students, there are thousands of other schools that closed between '86 and the present, whose former students continue to suffer from the burden of federal debt they do not owe. As a result, legal services organizations have a constant influx of borrowers whose schools closed from 2 to 35 years ago. All are low income, and most attended for-profit schools and are African American, Latinx, or other people of color. Most have no idea that they are eligible for a discharge, while others have been unable to obtain a discharge without the assistance of an attorney. They usually seek our help after they have defaulted and the government has garnished their wages, seized tax refunds, or seized portions of federal benefits such as Social Security. These punitive collection measures push our clients over the financial brink, ruining their credit histories and causing severe distress when they cannot afford to pay for rent, utilities, transportation to and from work, medical supplies, or even food. Thus, the department's decades-long failure to grant automatic closed school discharges has systemically removed wealth from economically disadvantaged families and communities of color through the collection of burdensome and invalid debt. Its failure has also prevented these borrowers from building wealth by barring many from earning a credential at a legitimate institution that would allow them to improve the economic well-being of their families. Cruelly, the communities hit hardest by the department's failure are the same communities currently hit hardest by the COVID-19 global health crisis. The department's application requirements and reluctance to provide widespread automatic closed school discharges have hindered Congress's broad remedial intent in enacting the Higher Education Act's closed discharge mandate. It has caused decades of unnecessary suffering to thousands of students who are disproportionately people of color, who are clearly eligible for discharges according to the department's own records. There is little to be gained by continuing to wage this economic war on poor people who were harmed through no fault of their own by sudden school closures. At a minimum, the department should immediately change course and comply with its statutory mandate by immediately beginning to grant automatic closed school discharges to all borrowers whose schools closed after January 1st of 1986, who are clearly eligible for discharges according to its own records. I describe in my written testimony other steps that the department should take to alleviate the devastating consequences of abrupt school closures. Thank you for your close attention to this urgent issue and for the opportunity to provide this testimony. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Under Committee Rule 9A, we will now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule. I will be recognizing our subcommittee members in seniority order. Again, to ensure that the members' 5-minute rule is adhered to, staff will be keeping track of time, and a timer will sign when time has expired. Please be attentive to the time. Wrap up when your time is over and remute your microphone. As a chairwoman, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Emery M. Rios, the automatic discharge process was designed to provide relief for borrowers if they did not complete their program or transfer to another school within 3 years after their college closed. Is this time period quick enough to catch eligible borrowers before they face negative financial consequences?
Good question. We found that 73% of the borrowers who went on to receive automatic discharges defaulted or were past due on those loans by 90 days or more prior to getting a discharge. And over half of those borrowers defaulted within a year and a half of the college closing. So within a year and a half, many were defaulting, and then it wasn't until a year and a half later that they received the discharge.
Wow. Ms. Rhodes, can you please describe your experiences in the first weeks immediately after school closed? Ms. Rhodes?
Yes, there we go. I'm sorry. Okay, after the few weeks of the school closing, I really wanted to complete my education and become a data entry clerk. I wanted to finish my schooling as I had planned to do. My school closing caused me great stress. I was so devastated about not completing my courses, graduating, and receiving my diploma. I didn't know what I was going to do now, and I was really worried about having outstanding loans. All I knew was that I had to continue working to provide for my daughter until I could figure it out. What my next step was going to be. I didn't apply to any other schools because accumulating another debt didn't make any sense to me. However, in 1991, I was offered an opportunity to assist as a junior operator in a salon, and I jumped on that opportunity to do the apprenticeship, and I became a cosmetologist.
Do you recall if you received any information about your eligibility for a closed school discharge during this time? And if so, was it difficult to understand or process given everything you were experiencing at the time? Did you know anything about this process?
No, at the time, there wasn't any closed school discharge, so I was unable to receive any information regarding my eligibility. And I feel like I was in the first wave of closed schools, and I was left to fight this issue on my own with no assistance from anyone.
Do you know if anyone else in your class was able to have any success the way that you were able to get success, or do you think most of them are just thrown away?
I would say we were thrown away. We were all in the same situation. The school closed, and we just had nowhere to turn, no information.
Were most of the students African American?
I will say it was mixed, but yeah, my area would be considered more African American.
And how were you recruited to go to the school? How did you find out about it?
I worked for Comcast, and I wanted to become a data entry clerk, and they had a position available, but I had to get a degree. So I just searched the internet and then found the school. And since it was about 5 minutes from my home, that was perfect for me. And I can take night classes and still take care of my daughter. So that's why I chose the school.
Were there any other people in your community who had gone to that school, or were there any recruitment efforts from that school or any other for-profit college in that community?
There were other students that was in my neighborhood, but I didn't know them personally, but they were from the general area, yes.
Were there any recruitment efforts from the for-profit school in that area to recruit students?
I would say yes, a little bit, because they were in like a mall. So of course, when you come in, they kind of would give you flyers to join the school. So yeah, a little bit of that recruitment.
Thank you so much. I now recognize the ranking member for the purpose of questioning the witnesses.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, or Madam Chairman, rather. And I want to thank all the witnesses that come today. Very good information. We obviously have a problem here. It's tragic when someone has put their name on the dotted line on a loan, and they put it forth with a good faith effort to get an education. And it's tragic when those places close their doors and then the person's left with a burden of debt that is through literally no fault of their own. That said, is it fair to have someone who's never been to college and but just works hard at a blue collar job to pay off that debt? There has to be something that we can put forth in the middle. And so let me just ask Mr. Cooper first a question. I'm intrigued by, I live in the world of medicine and we all have to have malpractice insurance regardless. Is there any avenue that we can put forth for these for-profit schools to get insurance up beforehand, before anything that goes on that is recognized as them having financial troubles? Because we all know that state institutions are backed by the state. They have backing in that regard. Private institutions, I went to a private undergraduate college, had a large endowment otherwise. And so I wonder if that's an avenue that has been pursued, we should pursue, that may help prevent the taxpayer from having to take the burden if defaults occur.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. That's a great question. So right now, the department does have some discretionary authority to request protection from schools when it looks like they're in danger of closure, such as requesting a letter of credit in order to make taxpayers whole in the event of a closed school discharge. The problem is that this is very reactive, not proactive.
Right.
That the department often waits to request a letter of credit until the problems at a school have already become apparent. And at that point, it's very hard for a school that has just been deemed financially irresponsible by the department to go to a bank and say, please give us a letter of credit. And so that's why I believe we need a more proactive approach to financial protection. And that's where my proposal for an insurance mandate comes in, which is analogous to the malpractice insurance mandate for doctors, which you described. If institutions wish to participate in the federal student loan program, they are putting some financial risk on taxpayers because there is a risk that those schools will close and there will be hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of closed school discharges associated with those closures that will place a burden on taxpayers. So my proposal is for them, as a condition of participating in the federal student loan program, to have to purchase insurance in order to make taxpayers whole in the event of a discharge. And this won't only have the benefit of protecting taxpayers, but will also have the benefit of providing a financial incentive for schools to make sure that when they do face the risk of closure, it's done in an orderly fashion and that students are able to either complete their programs through a teach out or transfer their credits to another school and complete their education there. Both of those scenarios would make them ineligible for a closed school discharge, but it will get them what they originally went to college for, which is a degree.
Yeah, I think that's actually I think that's a reasonable compromise for all this. We don't burden the taxpayers with money that unjustifiably is not their debt, but we hold them accountable for some of the other things. And one thing I wish we would also look into, I think one of the speakers commented that up to 94% of credits were not accepted by other institutions. Well, some of these institutions need to accept some of these credits, and I think as a condition of getting student loans, they need to be much more lenient in accepting credits from for-profit institutions, because we know that there's a profit motive on the nonprofit schools, that they want those students to pay and do more of that. So there has to be a happy medium. I think running to the one side where all of a sudden just there's more and more and more taxpayer money put into a program, put into these colleges and universities, I think is wrong. I think there's a much smarter way to do that protects consumers, protects students, but also protects colleges and universities. We don't need to have a hoarding approach to all of this. So, Madam Chairman, I'm not sure of my time that's left. How much time do I have left? I can't see you. 17 seconds. Well, I could talk about the baseball game last night, but we won't talk about that considering it was such a resounding victory. But anyway, I want to thank the speakers for coming out, and Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. Now, Mr. Decano, California.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I detect some glimmer of hope. I think the ranking member does recognize that there's a problem. However, these solutions, I really beg to differ. I don't see the good in, say, a top quality medical school being forced to accept credits from a fly-by-night medical school or a school, but let's not talk medical schools, but a regular school with a great reputation that has great standards to be accepting credits from a school that just closed. That makes no sense to me. That means even less accountability and less value for the taxpayer. But anyway, Ms. Smith, I want to thank you for your testimony today. Very quickly, before I begin the rest of my questions in response to the ranking member's testimony, I wanted to inquire if the extension of the look-back window for ITT was within the Education Department's authority.
Yes, the extension back was within the department's authority, both as extenuating circumstances, but it also has the clear authority to grant automatic discharges based on information in its own possession. It can determine and has determined who withdrew from that school before it closed within the extended period and is granting automatic discharges. So this really shows that the department has the authority and can in fact look back according to its own records to see who's eligible for a closed school discharge and grant widespread discharges if it wants to. For ITT Tech, I understand that's about 115,000 borrowers. That, of course, is just the tip of the iceberg. There are probably hundreds of thousands of borrowers who remain stuck with debts that they don't owe and struggling from that, who have no idea still that they should be eligible for a closed school discharge.
Well, thank you. Well, so the Department of Education has recently moved to provide other forms of loan relief, including total and permanent disability discharges to borrowers without requiring them to submit an application. Can you explain how automatic processes can remove major barriers for borrowers and get them benefits they are entitled to under law?
Sure. So as you all know, a closed school discharge not only discharges the debt, it also provides a restoration of Pell Grants and removes the negative history from credit reports. So people who have for decades dealt with defaulted debt, who struggled because they can't get ahead, they deal with wage garnishments, they have bad credit reports, they can't get housing. And I see these folks, many of whom are people of color, all the time, who've gone to schools in the 80s, the 90s, and as recent as, several years ago. So the closed school discharge is a bright light of hope for these borrowers who've struggled for so long, because it clears their history and they can go back to school. They don't have the psychological and emotional burden that kind of debt can bring. And so these discharges are incredibly important for restoring also the wealth to those communities. As I said, the communities most impacted are communities of color and low-income communities who've traditionally been excluded from higher education. So it is important to restore the wealth to those communities, to get them back on track to be able to go to legitimate institutions of higher education and pursue better, more financial stability for themselves and their communities.
So, Ms. Smith, would you consider shortening the period of eligibility for the closed school discharge relief from the current 3-year wait period? I mean, it seems like that wait period to me is a real problem.
Yes, it is. As Melissa explained, one of most borrowers, first of all, when a school closes, they look right away to transfer their credits. So it's within a year, I would say, that most borrowers decide either to move on to another school or to give up. So the other issue, of course, is you want to give them a closed school discharge before they go into default. They have 6 months grace period, then 270 days before they will go into default. So it's important, I think, to shorten the period to about 1 year, because that would get them out of default, keep them from going to default in the first place.
Well, thank you. I would like to explore that more, but my time is running out. It does seem to me that students are in a period of like real trauma and crisis. The school is closed. It's not their fault. They should be given the choice about whether what they do next. I mean, but anyway, before I yield back, Madam Chair, I'd like to enter into the record a statement submitted to the Higher Education Workforce Investment Committee from Veterans Education Success. A statement for the record. Asking consent.
So ordered. Thank you so much.
And I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Well, now, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. According to the U.S. Department of Education's College Affordability and Transparency Center, the average tuition rate for a public 2-year technical school is only $3,588. When Corinthian College closed its campuses, the Obama administration approved approximately 15,000 students for loan discharge relief who owed a total of $200 million in student debt, forcing the taxpayers to foot the bill. In other words, each former Corinthian student was on average granted over $13,000 in relief, meaning that it cost taxpayers nearly 4 times as much to pay for a borrower's school discharge claim than it does to pay for the entirety of their trade school education. Mr. Cooper, what are your thoughts on creating policy that allows students in the discharge process to pursue a different type of education at technical or trade school?
Thank you, Representative Banks. I think that is the number one goal, that when a school closes, we want students to have the opportunity to complete their education elsewhere, or complete their education at the original school through a teach out. Because when students take on loans, they're not taking on loans with the hope of that they'll eventually be discharged. They're taking on loans with the hope that they'll be able to use this financing in order to get a degree or certificate somewhere. And so I would say that is the number one goal. We do want them to transfer to other schools, whether those are other private institutions or community colleges, and complete a credential there. I do know that if the program to which they're transferring is significantly different from the program which they were originally enrolled in at the school that was closed, they still might be eligible for a closed school discharge in that circumstance. But still, it is the number one goal for them to be able to get that credential that they originally went to college for, and build a better life for themselves.
So we know that the department has historically had difficulties tracking transfer and re-enrollment of students at institutions of higher education. This is concerning given that the Biden administration's proposed changes to the closed school discharge regulations that were circulated this week would reinstate the automatic closed school discharge policy implemented under the Obama administration, but would change the re-enrollment period from 3 years to 1. So for instance, a student who attended a closed institution and had their loans discharged and then enrolled at a new institution a few years later in a similar program may receive a free degree. Mr. Cooper, can you explain why reinstating the automatic closed school discharge is a poor policy?
Yes, that is correct. That I believe that if you do instate these automatic closed school discharges, which are cast a very wide net, that I don't really see a way for the Department of Education to effectively verify when a successful transfer of credits and a successful degree completion at another college has taken place. That there are always going to be some errors like that. I see that as fairly unavoidable, specifically when you're looking back to pre-2014, pre-2019 enrollments in colleges, when the data on program enrollment was just much poorer. And that's why I believe that the approach really needs to be centered around making sure that closed school discharges are not even necessary in the first place. That, when we've exhausted all other options, yes, we should make it easier for people to receive a closed school discharge, but we should only do that after we've exhausted all other options. And we have exhausted the options of trying to get students into other programs where they might be able to get what they originally came for, which is a degree.
Mr. Cooper, what other federal policies have been enacted recently that you can think of that have propped up failing schools beyond their natural lifespan?
Yes, well, I do know that the Department of Education under President Obama did propose a number of policies that would have affected different sectors very differently. Specifically, they did target the for-profit sector specifically, and some of those regulations might have been justified in terms of trying to do a stronger emphasis on outcomes and accountability. But I do worry that some of those regulations have basically exempted entire swaths of the higher education system, specifically public and private nonprofit colleges that are enrolling the vast majority of students, about 86% of students, and therefore potentially ignoring the abuses and the potential poor outcomes that are transpiring at those schools, which were not covered by federal regulations.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And now, Ms. Manning of North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member. Mr. Cooper, I want to make sure I understand your proposal. You're suggesting that all schools should be required to purchase insurance to protect against losses for schools that shut down, leaving students with large debts and no degrees?
That is correct.
So you're suggesting this for nonprofit and for-profit schools?
Yes, that is correct, because both nonprofit and for-profit schools are subject to the current financial responsibility composite score regulations. And if either of them shut down, there are potential closed school discharge costs associated with them.
But I know you're aware that 86% of borrowers who were impacted by school closures attended for-profit schools, right?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And 96% of students who received closed school discharges between 2010 and 2020 schools attended for-profit schools, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
So you would punish all schools with this insurance requirement, even though the real problem lies with for-profit schools?
Well, I don't like to think of it as punishing schools. I like to think of it as making
You would
sure-
impose this burden on all schools.
Yes, but the
Okay,
premiums for-
and wouldn't you assume, Mr. Cooper, that schools required to purchase insurance would pass those additional costs on to students in their tuition or fees?
Yes, that is a potential cost, but I do believe that it could be rectified with additional aid to students to counterbalance.
So you actually want to increase student loan debt by saddling schools and therefore students with the cost of buying insurance.
That is not how I would state my position. I
No, but
believe
that's what the outcome would be, correct?
Yes, but I believe that
Okay,
we should.
and wouldn't this be a boon to the insurance industry?
Well, the insurance industry that would be able to sell insurance to these schools, yes, but the insurance
Okay,
industry. would
and
also
so
take
what
the
you're
risk.
proposing would help the insurance industry and would burden students with potentially higher student debt at a time when what we're trying to do is make school more affordable because more students need a higher education to get jobs that pay a livable wage. Isn't that correct?
Yes, but I believe that this proposal.
Okay,
would make
thank
it
you very
more
much.
likely that-
I'm going to move on to Ms. Emery Arras. Your testimony mentions that transferring to another college may not be a great option for students after closure. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Can you explain why is it that so many of the credits that students get at for-profit schools are non-transferable?
Thank you for that question. So when students transfer, there are two issues. One is, can they bring their credits with them? And two is, can they complete their education at that second school? And in terms of that first issue of can they bring their credits with them, in this work, looking at closed schools, we found that most students leaving a for-profit transferred to another for-profit school. And in our prior work, we found that for that pathway, students lose on average 83% of their credits. Another common pathway that we found in this work is going from a for-profit school to a public school. And as you've heard, previously we found that that pathway results in a loss of 94% of credits. And I would say—
And why is that? Why is it that nonprofit schools are so reluctant to accept the credits from for-profit schools?
I'm not able to comment on that. It's not the subject of this work, but I would say that that those rates are much higher than the average credit loss rates. In average, we found previously when students transferred, regardless of where they were coming from and where they were going, they lost a little over 40%. So these rates we're seeing are more than double the transfer loss rates for the general population per our prior work.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Smith, do you have any answer to why so many credits are lost when transferring from for-profits to nonprofits?
Yes, thank you for that question. In our experience, the majority of for-profit schools that close suddenly, there's been a large time period during which the education has deteriorated. When a school is having financial issues, they tend to cut salaries, they stop paying teachers stop showing up, they stop updating the equipment. And in addition, these are often schools that are already very low quality and engage in other types of fraud to get the students in the door. So the students from these schools don't actually often have the skills or the education they need to succeed starting at a higher level at another institution. So those institutions take a hard look at those credits and say, can this student actually succeed in starting at a higher level, or do they really need to take retake those courses so they get a good education. We don't want people dropping out because they're put into a higher level course and then they can't complete it. So that's a primary reason that you don't see the transfers.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ms. Miller Meeks of Iowa.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman. And I find it fascinating that that there's a concern about having all colleges pay into insurance to cover colleges that are discharged when we've just passed legislation and passed appropriations that don't cover the Hyde Amendment. So we want all taxpayers to pay for abortions, even if you're morally or religiously opposed to abortions. So there seems to be no concern about having all taxpayers pay for other things when it's to someone's preference. So interestingly enough, Mr. Cooper, you noted that the higher education landscape is changing and that federal policy should adapt with it. What are some of the key changes or drivers of this changing landscape? And how big of an impact do you believe that changing demographics will have on college enrollment?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So one of the most important factors that are driving changes in higher education enrollment is the fact that higher education is a rather counter-cyclical industry. So when the economy is not so great, people will tend to want to go back to school in order to get another degree and potentially increase the scope of their job opportunities. And when the economy is doing better, then the labor market will look much better relative to education, because higher wages and more jobs available will mean more opportunities out there. During the decade of the 2010s, we did see this, that there was a long decline in college enrollment between 2010 and 2019. That may be the case again as the economy begins to recover from the COVID-19 recession. And this is going to have effects on the higher education sector, that when enrollment contracts in this way due to the improving economy, not all colleges are going to be able to survive. And that's a natural part of the cyclicality of the higher education sector. And some colleges are going to close. It's unfortunate, but it is a reality. And that's why we do need to be prepared for when those college closures happen and make sure that both students and taxpayers are protected.
So I think that we saw this in the past several years when you had MBA programs at both public and private colleges. There was a proliferation of MBA programs, but now we've seen those close. And part of that, I think, is this dynamic between the college degree, the degree you're achieving, and then the income opportunities or employment opportunities thereafter. And do they, is there a benefit to getting that higher education? So is this demographic similar for undergraduate as well as for graduate schools, that your landscape that you're talking about changing?
That is definitely true. When the economy is improving and when there are more opportunities out there, that reduces the demand to get the next degree, because students will say, why should I spend 2 or 3 or 4 years in college when there's a great job opportunity waiting for me right now? But when the economy does turn south, then you do see students going into those MBA programs, which might not have the returns they promise, or going into other programs that they hope will be able to graduate them to a better life. But it is extremely cyclical, and it's getting more cyclical with each business cycle.
And I think, certainly we don't, we want all bad actors, bad performers held accountable. We want students who are trying to, improve their education, get a better education, improve their employment opportunities. We want them to be made whole. And so I guess in that vein, looking at what's happened in the past and where we are economically now, do you see more colleges closing their doors in the very near future?
I think it's certainly a possibility. We don't still fully understand how college enrollment, and therefore the number of colleges operating, is going to react to the COVID-19 pandemic. If we recover fairly quickly economically, that might result in fewer students going to college and therefore more college closures. I'm not going to say that it's definitely going to happen, but it's definitely a major possibility and an eventuality that we need to be prepared for.
And thank you so much. I thank all of our witnesses, and I yield back my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. And now we'll hear from our Vice Chair of the committee, Mr. Bowman of New York. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Mrs. Rhodes, thank you for being here today and telling us your story. As you say, our education system failed you on so many levels. I was particularly heartbroken to hear in your testimony that you have been eligible for a closed school discharge since 1994, but that you were never made aware of the process or of your eligibility. If the closed school discharge process had applied to you automatically back in the 90s, how would that have affected your life?
Well, I will say this, if the school closed discharge was applied automatically, it would have made my life easier and less stressful. I really wanted to succeed at this school, but that wasn't an option for me after the school closed. I would have continued pursuing my education at another school of my choice, and I would have definitely graduated. I am a motivated woman who never gives up. When my mind is set on something I want, I will pursue it and complete it. I eventually finished several education courses that I did not have to take out student loans for, despite what happened to me. I am now a cosmetologist, salon owner, a real estate agent, and I own a trucking company with my husband. So I succeeded. But
of course you did, because you're strong. That's why you succeeded. Thank you so much for sharing that. Ms. Emery Aris, thank you for being with us as well. I know that I and my colleagues on this committee appreciate the extensive work that the GAO has done to investigate and shine a light on this topic. Your testimony provided really important information on how college closures affect borrowers and how important the closed school discharge process is. And I'm hoping you can provide a bit more information about the experiences of these borrowers related to defaults. Specifically, how do the default rates for borrowers affected by a college closure differ from the average borrower?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. The default rates for borrowers who went to closed schools are higher than the default rates for the general student population. For example, we found that between 2010 and 2020, 19% of all borrowers who attended closed schools defaulted, and that 19% was much higher than the comparable rate in the general federal student loan borrower population, which was about 11%. But think about those numbers, 19% for everyone affected by a school closure. Now let's move to those who are affected by the automatic loan discharge process. Those folks have even higher default rates. The people who were then eligible for automatic discharges defaulted at 52%. So those are folks that are in significant distress, and those people are defaulting on loans that are eligible to be discharged, and they're defaulting about a year and a half after their school closes, and then waiting for another year and a half to get the discharge.
Yeah. Thank you. Quick follow-up. In your opinion, what do these differential rates tell us about how we can improve our higher education system to better support all students?
GAO doesn't have a particular opinion on this issue. We just want to make sure that the facts are available for policymakers to consider.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. And now we'll hear from Representative Good.
Thank you, Chairwoman Wilson and Ranking Member Murphy for holding this important hearing. It's crucial that American institutions of higher learning are providing the best possible education for our students. In a free market economy, it's important for students to be incentivized to complete their degrees and equipped with the tools to contribute to the workforce. It's also essential that competitive forces would incentivize educational institutions to provide the best possible education for our students. I am concerned that colleges and universities aren't focused on the most important, pardon me, I lost my place there, that they aren't focused on the most important thing, which is developing critical thinking students who are effectively prepared to contribute to the American economy. As has been said in testimony today, instead of trying to right the ship, it seems too often that that these sinking schools are just throwing up their hands and walking away and shirking all responsibility and leaving American taxpayers holding the bag. I hope that moving forward, we can have truly beneficial discussions surrounding this topic and not resort to the consistent default solution from my colleagues in the majority to simply throw more money at the issue and simply forgive loans with zero questions asked. I would also ask the majority to consider the fiscal implications of all the policies that we enact, because that has to always be a factor for a sustainable government and a sustainable economy. I would also ask the majority would consider the morality of flippantly requiring those who don't or can't attend college, or those who sacrifice diligently to pay off their own student loans, to be required to pay for the student loan balances of others, regardless of the circumstances. That said, Mr. Cooper, thank you for taking the time to come before the committee today. You said that when discharges occur, it means that we failed our students. You're exactly right. And I would add that the policies of the current administration are failing our students in many other ways as well. And I appreciate your testimony. You mentioned that the composite score tool used to determine the financial health of an institution is an untenable tool. What would a responsible and accurate evaluation tool that would give a timely and thorough assessment of the financial state of institution look like?
Thank you, Congressman. So in 2017, the GAO identified a number of shortcomings with the financial responsibility composite score metric. One of the most important in my mind is that it only looks at the financial metrics for a single fiscal year, but pretty much any accountant in the private sector will tell you that you need to look at what are the trends. Are institutions getting more financially healthy, less financially healthy? What are the historical trends? What are the future projections? That you need to have that context in order to get a true assessment of the institution's financial health. Another major problem with the scores is that they're vulnerable to manipulation by colleges, which have armies of accountants to figure out every loophole in the scores. Most infamously, Corinthian colleges would manipulate its scores while it was still in existence by borrowing tens of $millions in long-term debt on the last day of a fiscal year, paying it back on the next day during the next fiscal year, and getting credit for all those for all those debt repayments. So there are certainly ways that we could fix the financial responsibility formula today, and I believe the Department of Education is actively working on them. They haven't addressed all of the shortcomings. I'm glad to see that they're at least thinking about it. But I think in the long run, the only way to ensure that the metrics of financial responsibility are keeping up with the times and keeping up with what a financially responsible institution looks like in the 21st century is to bring the private sector into the equation and to leverage the power of the private insurance industry in order to help assess how healthy are institutions really, and what can we do in order to make them more financially healthy.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you might add that changes you feel like should be made to the accreditation processes to ensure that these educational institutions are held accountable for the product they're producing?
I agree. I think that the accreditation system is not really well suited to the task of gatekeeping the hundreds of billions of dollars in federal loan and grant money that go out the door every year. And that's why I think we should be probably moving away from relying on accreditors to hold colleges accountable and more towards a system of outcomes-based accountability, incentives-based accountability that directly holds institutions accountable for their financial health and for the outcomes that they're delivering for students.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. And Madam Chairman, I see I'm out of time, so I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ms. Bonamici, Oregon, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you to the chair and ranking member, but truly thank you to our witnesses today. Ms. Rhodes, just following up on Representative Bowman's comment, you started your data entry clerk program in 1988, and the Higher Education Act was changed to add the closed school provisions in 1992. So you were eligible shortly thereafter, and I'm glad you found legal aid, but I find it tragic that it took decades. And listening to your story, and thank you for sharing it, really, I think, exemplifies why we need to make some changes here today. We've had unanticipated closures, we know, of institutions, and especially for-profit colleges. And they can have devastating effects on students academically and financially. And again, Ms. Rhodes, thank you for sharing your personal story. I just can't imagine what those decades were like for you and the frustration. I used to work at Legal Aid, so I understand the importance of the work they do, but I also understand what you were going through. And so since 2017, Oregon, my home state, has seen a significant number of school closures: Marist University, Concordia University, Oregon Culinary Institute, Pioneer Pacific College. We have to do everything we can to assist students who are faced with the consequences of those closed schools. And I do note that there are the options of transferring credits and teach out programs. But as we've heard, a lot of credits just don't transfer, especially from for-profit institutions. So the GAO found that tens of thousands of borrowers eligible for closed school discharges were not applying for forgiveness, even though most of them were suffering financial consequences. So I want to ask Ms. Smith, what steps can the department take to improve outreach and communication to borrowers who have been affected by school closures so they are aware of all their options, including their potential eligibility for a discharge?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. The department can do a lot to improve outreach. For example, it can do a lot more with emails that are clearly labeled closed school discharges. It can provide many more communications to students as soon as the school closes, instead of waiting, for example, 6 months to contact those students. But the point I think that's most important to make is that no matter what the department does, you're going to have a significant number of borrowers who just don't know or understand their closed school discharge rights. When a school closes, it's complete chaos.
Right.
Usually students are getting incomplete and inaccurate information from their schools, who typically push them into enrolling somewhere else and transferring credits so that they are not liable for a closed school discharge amounts to the department. And students and the government are both focused on helping them to transfer credits. So they're not really thinking at that point about what other options they have, and they are in a state of panic and distress so that they often don't even notice that information if it is provided.
Right. I want to try to get another question in, Ms. Smith, also for you, and I appreciate that the answer. With so much of what we do here, we're looking at how we address problems after they happen, but we really need to look at prevention. So an additional step would be for the department to be more aware of the warning signs. For example, ITT Technical Institute, officially closed in 2016. There were signs of financial issues for several years, which the department recently shared in their decision to extend eligibility for students receiving the closed school discharges. At the time of their closure, ITT Tech had 520 students enrolled in Portland and Salem in Oregon. Concordia University in Portland similarly had long-standing financial trouble that contributed in part because of enrollment decline, but they began consolidating courses of study. But what really changes should the department or other regulatory entities make so they can act earlier in the process to protect students and taxpayers?
In the case of ITT Tech and many of the schools, the department had information and could have taken steps much sooner. It should, I think, create an enforcement unit that not only tracks these schools financially and do a better job of it, but also do more investigations and regarding potential fraud. And the point I want to make is that as long as you have for-profit education receiving guaranteed federal subsidies of up to 90% of their revenues, there is going to be fraud, there will be school closures. Whenever you have businesses receiving that much money from one guaranteed source, no matter what you do, you will have school closures, no matter what the steps the department takes to monitor those schools.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much. And I know that we're working on it with the Higher Education Act reauthorization. And I'm out of time, but I just want to note that I'll be submitting a question because of this accountability issue about the financial responsibility composite score and what we can do to make sure that that is really more accurate and helpful in identifying problems at the outset. So I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, Bobby.
Mr. Grothman of Wisconsin.
Oh, there. Okay. Okay. I've got another question for Mr. Cooper. I think your proposal, what you're saying here, is in line with the view many of us have. Specifically, I think that schools like taxpayers have to have some skin in the game. However, your proposal also introduced another actor in the mix, that have an incentive to protect students and taxpayers because they too bear financial risk. Why is it important that federal policy ensures that all stakeholders have skin in the game? And are there examples in federal policy, including those outside of higher education, that illustrate the benefit of risk sharing?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, I believe that accountability is key. It's most important, and one of the reasons that we do see so many disasters in the closed school discharge arena is that right now schools really do not have the financial incentives to serve their students well in the event of a closure. That we do need to make sure that those that procedures are in place for students to either be able to complete a teach out or transfer their credits in the event of a school closure. And that's where my insurance proposal comes in, that this is one of the things that will provide a direct financial incentive for that to happen. But the conversation about incentives and accountability shouldn't necessarily end there. That I think that there is potential for an entire overhaul of the way that we do higher education accountability, to focus it more around incentives. One of the proposals out there, which has attracted bipartisan interest, is to do some sort of risk sharing for institutions which participate in federal aid programs. And basically the idea behind this is that if students are unable to repay their federal student loans after attending a college or university, that the college or university would then be liable for a portion of the unpaid debts. And this would align the incentives of both the school and the student, because if the student is able to graduate and get a good paying job and pay back their loans, then the institution will be placed under much less financial liability for that. So yes, I believe that making use of incentives in order to do accountability for institutions which are dependent on the federal purse for their revenues is basically the only way to ensure that we don't have repeat disasters like we saw with Corinthian ITT Tech and the many other disasters that have been mentioned over the course of this hearing.
Okay. You made an important point in your testimony that students ultimately go to college to get a degree. And I think the approach taken by Secretary DeVos recognized that. Are there particular policies in the that the Biden administration should consider during the rulemaking process that were implemented under the previous administration?
Yes, I think one of the most important policies that the Biden administration could continue is the DeVos administration's policy of transparency. So in 2019, the DeVos Department of Education launched what's called the program level college scorecard, which is a first of its kind database that essentially provides outcomes information for many different, over 200,000 different programs, both bachelor's degrees, associate's degrees, certificates, graduate degrees. It provides earnings data, it provides loan repayment rates, and this is really an invaluable source of information for students who are looking for the best way to get an education, to create a better life for themselves, to graduate into a job which is going to deliver them a middle-class income and a middle-class lifestyle. I'm encouraged to see that there's bipartisan interest in this. Both the Obama, the Trump, and the Biden administrations seem to have interest in continuing these transparency efforts. And I look forward to seeing what the Biden administration will do on this.
I'll give you another question. I don't know how to answer it. When you begin to do things like put graduation rates and that in there, that's helpful. But I think we also use graduation rates as an important sign that we have a good or bad high school. And I think one of the ways schools deal with it is just let everybody graduate. Already you run into people with college degrees. You wonder, you got a college degree. Are you afraid, and how do you deal with the fact that as people, go down this path, the universities just dumb down the degrees to look good?
I agree, that's definitely a concern, and that's one reason why I'm reluctant to do accountability policy directly based on graduation rate, because as you say, that is very easy for the institution to manipulate. And I think that if it's done, it should be done in conjunction with other metrics such as graduate earnings and loan repayment rates, which are much harder for the institutions to fake.
Okay, would you be in favor of some sort of generalized test to say you got to pass the test to get a college degree?
I think it's certainly a possibility that we could consider, but I also think we should recognize that higher education has a huge diversity of offerings out there, and not all programs are going to teach the same material. And I'm not sure it would be possible to design a standardized test, which is both going to test the knowledge earned during a liberal arts bachelor's degree and a certificate in welding at a community college.
Thank you, and thank you for letting me go over.
Thank you so much. Ms. Espaillat of New York, welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question is for Melissa Emery Aras. According to your testimony, the automatic discharge process is not an option for all borrowers that are eligible for a closed school discharge. Can you explain which borrowers are not being caught in this safety net? Who does that apply to?
Happy to, Congressman. Thank you for the question. There are two groups that are not eligible for the automatic process. So they are eligible to apply, but they cannot get it automatically. Those are individuals who transfer but don't complete their program at the second college. And what we found in our work was that almost half of the people who did transfer were in this situation of not completing within 6 years. So you have a sizable population that are transferring and not completing, and those individuals are not eligible for that automatic process. Similarly, there's a second group of borrowers who transfer to another college in what's called a non-comparable program. So it's different than the original program that they were studying at the first college. Those folks are also eligible for a discharge, but cannot obtain it automatically.
Thank you. My next question is for Karen Rose. Karen, may you describe the process of pulling together and completing a closed school discharge application? How was your experience with that?
Thank you for the question. It wasn't easy. And it was the most difficult part for me was finding proof of documentation from 1988 needed for my application. And my lawyer from Legal Aid was able to find more information than I was, which was unbelievable. My application was denied at first, and then Legal Aid sent an appeal, and then it was granted after that. And it took almost 2 years to finally get my school loan discharged and receive relief from the debt. So it was.
So were you able to get like a lawyer easily, or someone that was experienced in this area?
No, actually, I contacted Legal Aid through researching the internet and found that American Business Institute, there was a class action suit. And that's how I was able to reach Legal Aid. They were handling the class action suit. So,
I see. So it's not like Legal Aid had a unit within their, within their office that dealt, with this kind of help, right?
Not to my knowledge. I just saw them on the internet and I reached out to them immediately because that was the first time I had seen anything related to my school that I could get some assistance.
Okay, and how long did you have to wait to receive relief from the Department of Education?
It was about 2 years. I contacted Legal Aid in 2018. And so it took about 2 years from then for the process from them starting the application to being denied and then submitting an appeal. And then I was granted my closed school discharge after that in August 2020.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. My last question is to Robin Smith. And you mentioned in your testimony that many of the individuals you worked with have been unable to obtain a discharge without the assistance of an attorney, right? So on this same line of thought, how difficult is it out there to get an attorney? And it seems that it's necessary to have one to really be able to navigate through this entire process.
That's a great question. Thank you so much. First of all, we do have 1.5, I'm half, attorneys dedicated to student loans at Legal Aid Foundation of LA, but most legal aids in the country just don't have the resources to do that. So it's very difficult for most low-income people to get legal assistance. It is difficult also to get these closed school discharges. often because schools have reported incorrect information to the department. In Ms. Rhodes' case, the American Business Institute, which at the same time was being prosecuted for fraud, had fraudulently reported that she graduated before the school closed. That meant that we, after the appeal, after the initial application was denied, we had to do a FOIA request to the Department of Education to get evidence to show that it did in fact lie about student outcomes. And that's what took us a year and a half to do before we could successfully appeal her case.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back. Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Ledlow, welcome.
Thank you. And to all the witnesses, thank you for taking the time to testify before the committee today. It's deeply concerning that the rate of school closures has drastically increased over the last decade. School closures are harmful to students and the educational system as a whole. I've said before, education is the key to success. We must do all we can to ensure our students have the opportunity to learn, grow, and find career opportunities that best suit their talents. Therefore, I believe Congress and the department should focus our attention to help students who are enrolled in a closing school to receive assistance to continue their education. We should not leave students without a path forward to obtain a degree. Mr. Cooper, simply forgiving the debt of students attending closed schools without ensuring they have had every opportunity to continue their education seems like a misguided approach. Rather, it's important that Congress and the department value the time and effort and the work these students did during their time at school. Do you believe our current policies are too heavily slanted towards loan discharge rather than helping students complete their education?
It's certainly, that seems to be my perception that may be the case, that there doesn't seem to be enough emphasis on helping students get what they originally came to college for, which is a degree or certificate, helping them either complete their program or transfer their credits to another school and complete there. It does seem at times that the goal of the administration is to deliver as many closed school discharges as possible, rather than necessarily try to help these students get what they originally came to college for. That's not to say that that's always going to be a great option. I mean, some schools were fraudulent, and the proper remedy there is probably is closed school discharge, but that's not the case all the time. And I do believe that there should be more emphasis on helping students complete the education that they originally set out to get in the first place.
Thank you so much. I do have a follow-up question for you, Mr. Cooper. As you noted in your testimony, the Biden administration recently expanded the look-back window for discharge eligibility to students attending ITT Tech to 8 years before its closure. I find it difficult to believe that the department has had the ability to accurately verify the over 115,000 claims that they approved. In fact, the Office of Federal Student Aid announced this month that a number of borrowers improperly received approvals for borrower defense claims as they did not attend an eligible school. Do you have any indication as to how the department may be verifying this information? And how can we ensure that taxpayer dollars are not being spent on fraudulent or incorrect discharge cases?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I don't have any special insight into the department's process for how they're adjudicating these claims, but I would say that I'm skeptical that, especially when you have a look back window that's going back to 2008, 13 years ago, before a lot of the more sophisticated transfer tracking data and program tracking data came online, I would be very skeptical that they're able to verify truly whether each of those students who's receiving a discharge is in fact eligible for one.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cooper. And I yield back the remainder of my time to the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Dr. Letlow. While I appreciate the work GAO has done in compiling this data on closed school discharges, it seems to me this work is far from complete. While GAO's testimony includes some potentially troubling numbers, we do not have the additional context necessarily properly assess this data, as our Mr. Cooper just indicated. Indeed, the report does not include any context as to why some students have not received relief. Further, there's nothing to help further the discussion about which policies may be effective and which need reform. Unfortunately, we know that over the next decade, many institutions will close their doors because students are increasingly looking for options other than the traditional brick and mortar model. Federal policy needs to adapt to these changes. Rather than rushing a hearing on an incomplete report, the responsible thing to do would be to let GAO complete its work so we have a full picture about the implications of the department's policies. In the meantime, I'd suggest the committee turn its focus toward a bipartisan reform of the Higher Ed Act. So, Mr. Cooper, I have a question. Under certain circumstances, institutions may be required to remit a letter of credit to the department to serve as collateral when there are concerns about the financial viability of an institution. Mr. Cooper, as you noted in your testimony, your proposal is similar to this policy, but is more proactive. In essence, your proposal would address these problems on the front end rather than have taxpayers pick up the tab on the back end. Can you describe the benefits of a more proactive approach such as yours, including for students, schools, and taxpayers?
Thank you, Dr. Fox. I'd be happy to. So as you noted, one of the main problems right now with the way we're holding institutions accountable for their financial outcomes is that our system is very reactive. So the department does have the authority to request letters of credit from financially troubled schools in order to protect taxpayers, but often the department waits to request these letters of credit until the financial troubles have become apparent, and few banks are willing to extend this kind of surety to an institution which the department has just said is in serious financial trouble. In some cases, requesting a letter of credit can actually accelerate the collapse of an institution, as we saw in the case of ITT Tech, in which the department requested a letter of credit from the institution, which ITT Tech was not able to secure, and therefore had to shut down just 2 weeks after the department made its request. This is why we need a more proactive approach in terms of holding schools accountable for the costs that they're going to that they impose on taxpayers. I believe that if an institution decides to participate in the federal student loan program, it is putting a certain amount of financial risk on taxpayers who will have to pick up the tab if the school closes without a teach out plan or without a transfer of credit policies in place. And that's why, because institutions are presenting this risk to taxpayers, that they should be required to purchase insurance in order to make taxpayers whole in the event of a closure, which will also provide the right incentives for schools to make sure that they're, when a closure does have to happen, the school is wound down in an orderly fashion and students have numerous options to complete their education.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to yield back time from my time. Madam Chair, I wouldn't go over that long, except I'll yield back time when it's my time, okay?
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it. And now, Mr. Castro of Texas.
Thank you, Chair. The Department of Education has a duty under federal law to provide debt relief to students who were defrauded by a for-profit college and left holding the bag with nothing to show for it. School closures have left thousands of students, many unable to find jobs in their field of study, saddled with incredible student loan debt. And too many families shoulder the burden of debt when relief is available. To think that about half of eligible borrowers did not apply for a discharge even 3 years after their school closed and struggle with crippling debt is really shameful. And that's why the conversation we're having today about supporting these students is very important. Restoring the automatic discharge process is the right thing to do. We must protect students when they're affected by abrupt school closures. And I'm glad the Biden administration is taking steps to extend relief to students. I'd like to hear from Ms. Rhodes, our student borrower witness, so that she can share with the committee how the Department of Education could have assisted her and many students who needed relief. And so, Ms. Rhodes, I had a question for you. Although you were eventually able to get your loans discharged, how do you think the Department of Education should have done a better job to mitigate the consequences that you experienced? And also, after your school closed, how long did it take you to decide your next steps and whether or not you wanted to transfer to another institution?
Thank you. As far as what I feel the Department of Education should have done, I feel that they should have done a better job to mitigate the consequences of the school closure for all students. When they decided to close the school, there should have been a program in place to help students transition from a closed school to another school of their choice. They should have made sure that all of the students with a loan from any school closure had access to the appropriate resources, and that could have discharged their debt. My hope is that the Department of Education will implement a program that is easy for students to be informed about their options when a school closes, inform them on how to transfer to another school about the discharge process, giving students like myself the full access to the resources needed to complete their application and receive their discharge loans in a timely manner. It shouldn't take several years to get assistance or relief from a closed school loan. And your second question.
How long did it take you to decide your next steps and whether or not you wanted to transfer to another institution?
Okay, it didn't take me very long to figure out my next steps because I basically was working and just decided to continue to work. Once I realized the school was closed and I had no other options, no assistance to help me, I just continued working and just moved on. That was my only options at the time.
Was there any, in your discussions with others that were affected in the same way that you were, classmates, for example, is there any other advice that you have for us or anything else that you picked up from them that you want to share with the committee as we think about this issue?
Basically, I really feel like it should be some kind of mainly informing the students of what's going on, because I think that was the biggest problem. We didn't know what was going on. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know why the school was closing. We're hearing information secondhand, and then we have no resources to go anywhere to get assistance. So our hands were kind of tied. It's like, what do? You have this debt looming over you and you can't do anything about it and you have to pay it back. And then I, for years, felt that it was very unfair that I had to carry a debt and be responsible, and then it's ballooning to $26,000 and I can't get any assistance. And even when I applied, I was denied without having a legal aid or attorney. So it's very difficult to navigate the process. So they need to have something to help us be able to work through the process.
No, well, thank you, Ms. Rhodes, for sharing your story with us. Thank you. You know, when for-profit institutions close their doors, often thousands, hundreds or thousands of students suffer. And so we want to make sure that we prioritize the needs of defrauded students and provide immediate and complete relief to them. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Castro. And now we'll go to Ranking Member Fox. You have 4 minutes left.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that very much. I will keep to my commitment. Mr. Cooper, I would like to go back to you. While my colleagues are focused on one particular sector, both your testimony and that of GAOs note that for-profits are not the only schools that have been forced to close their doors. Further, I think it's safe to say that many more will have closed in the previous 18 months. Many more would have closed in the previous 18 months if it were not for the substantial support provided through the CARES Act and subsequent relief packages. What factors are driving this trend of nonprofit school closures, and what do you expect this trend? And do you expect this trend to accelerate? What changes to the way we handle these closures should be made to prepare for this coming consolidation in higher education?
Thank you, Dr. Fox. Yes, as you mentioned, that for-profit institutions are not the only institutions that close. While they're most of them, they're not all of the institutions. And I do worry that, as we're seeing, the number of students participating in higher education has been dropping since about 2010. And that's a pretty natural process because as the economy was improving over the course of the 2010s, fewer students wanted to go into education. Most had better job opportunities. There are more jobs available. There are higher earning jobs available. And so the labor market simply looked more attractive to them. And so this is great for students, obviously, but it leaves the question of what happens to the institutions. And of course, some of them are going to close. That's a natural part of the higher education system. Institutions are going to close sometimes. And we do need to make sure that we're prepared to deal with the consequences of those closures when they happen. Private nonprofit institutions, as you noted, were buoyed by the tremendous relief that Congress committed in the CARES Act and subsequent relief packages, which definitely staved off a number of college closures. But that might not be the case forever. It might be the case that we might see another round of college closures as the economy recovers from the recession associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's no guarantee that all of those closures are going to be for-profit colleges. It's possible that private nonprofit colleges will be among the closures as well. It's also possible, I would say, that for-profit colleges, in order to avoid the disproportionate regulation that is targeting them, might simply decide to change their tax status to nonprofit and thereby avoid those regulations, which is one reason that we also can't ignore the private nonprofit sector. So yes, it's something that we absolutely need to be prepared for, and that's why I believe the insurance mandate proposal that I laid out in my written testimony is the best way to use incentives-based accountability in order to protect taxpayers and students when these closures inevitably happen.
Oh, thank you very much. Ms. Emery-Aris, isn't it true that borrowers will still be able to obtain a closed school discharge by submitting a short application? And can you describe quickly what this application process looks like?
Yes, Dr. Fox, thank you for the question. Yes, borrowers will still be able to apply for a discharge through that process, and they will need to complete the application form, which is 2.5 pages and has information about the borrower and their attendance at the closed school.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you, Madam Chairman, for your tolerance on my going over at the time that was given to me. I yield back.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We'll now hear from the chairman, our distinguished chairman of the committee, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being with us today. First, Ms. Smith, in the clients that you represent, are they given any credit for payments made after they were entitled to discharge, or is just the balance due when the dust settles is the only thing that gets discharged?
Thank you. That's a great question. When the discharge happens, they get a complete discharge of all amounts that are outstanding on the debt. So that includes interest and fees. They also get a refund of any amounts that they have paid back. And they do also get their Pell Grant eligibility restored, which is very important because then that allows them to restart a higher education at a legitimate institution if they want to.
What do they get paid back?
When it sometimes
what do they get paid back?
They get paid back all amounts that were involuntarily taken from them. For example, if tax refunds were taken, if their wages were garnished, if Social Security was offset, they get all of that money back.
What about payments that were made after they were entitled to a discharge?
Yes, all of that is returned as well.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Emery-Aris, we've heard a little back and forth about nonprofits and profits. We're looking into the for-profit conversions into non-profit for the reasons that have been articulated to avoid any abuse there. But what is the percentage of those abruptly closing in terms of profit and nonprofit?
I don't have the figures for the schools at my hand, but I know that 86% of the borrowers who were affected by school closures had been attending for-profit schools.
Thank you. And we've heard from the ranking member and from Mr. Cooper about the importance of being proactive rather than reactive. Let me ask you a couple of questions all at once. One is, should we be expecting more from our creditors? These things they don't go insolvent overnight. Should the creditors be doing more? And if they abruptly close, what could we have done to have made the school, not the taxpayer, pay for the for the closed school discharges? We know there's a letter of credit that can be available. But I understand one school had a nice letter of credit, but the Department of Education let them spend most of it. So when the dust settles, there wasn't much for reimbursement. What could we reasonably expect in terms of bonding to cover these losses and personal responsibility for officers that were involved in the fraud?
Thank you for those questions, Chairman Scott. In terms of our prior work, I can note that we have done work previously looking at accreditors and whether accreditors sanctioned schools that were in financial distress. And we found that they did not always do so. So we have that work out there that shows that they have not always done that. In addition, we have done work. Actually, let me clarify. This work is a little bit dated, but the work on the accreditors found that they did not always sanction for schools that had quality metrics. They actually did a better job on the financial metrics side in terms of holding schools accountable. In terms of our other work on what the Department of Education should do, we have an existing recommendation that has been referred to previously in Mr. Cooper's statement, which is to have the Department of Education improve the financial composite score. We found that it is an imprecise measure of school closures. It does not always predict which schools are going to close. Those that are in financial trouble are not always caught in this metric. And we have an outstanding recommendation on that issue from 2017. So we're still waiting for the Department of Education to implement our recommendation. And our recommendation is to improve that composite score so that it does take into account broader metrics of financial health, including liquidity and historical trends.
And he also suggested it could be subject to manipulation. I assume your recommendation would correct for that. But what about bonding and personal responsibility to recoup the losses rather than taxpayer getting left holding the bag?
We haven't done work on that, sir.
In terms of the bonding or letters of credit?
We have done work in that prior study on the financial responsibility score, looking at the fact that letters of credit are required. But again, you may not get to that point if the financial composite score doesn't correctly identify schools in financial distress. So even if that is a potential tool, the department, they may not always use that tool.
And you didn't look into personal responsibility of officers who may be involved in the fraud?
Correct. We have not looked at that, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. You're back. Madam Chair, are you back?
Ms. McLean?
Hi, thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm curious, and I have a couple questions, is we're not forcing these students to go to a for-profit college, correct? They do have options to go to a nonprofit college, correct? Anyone can answer.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so the student does have some choice in terms of what college they choose, right? I guess my question is this: why is the answer always a bailout on the taxpayer when students have choices? Now, I'm not saying that I don't have any empathy for the students who fall victim to this, but at the end of the day, why, if they have a choice, does the bearer of the responsibility always fall on the taxpayer. I don't think that's fair either. So, Mr. Cooper, I think something needs to be said for personal responsibility. So students are willingly taking out massive loans for an education. Do you get any sense that these students are doing the background research that they need to do prior to taking out this massive loan and choosing the school of choice before they take out thousands of dollars in loans?
Thank you, Congresswoman McLean. I think it's definitely very important to consider personal responsibility in these discussions. That it often goes unexamined. And yes, there is a responsibility for the student to do their due diligence when they're choosing a school, and to make use of the data that is available out there that the Department of Education under Secretary DeVos and has made available on student outcomes. But I also don't believe that. I also do believe that there are things that policymakers can also do in order to guide the system in the right direction. Because the education department, as we've seen, as Ms. Emery-Ross has noted, is not necessarily great at predicting when these schools are going to close. That their current financial responsibility metrics are simply not predictive. They're somewhat predictive, but they're generally not very good at predicting when these schools are going to close. And so I also wonder that when the Department of Education is having such a hard time with this, that students might also not necessarily have all the information available to them in order to figure out, is this school that I'm attending is at risk of closure? Because as we've seen, the data that the Department of Education is putting out in terms of the financial responsibility metrics, the financial responsibility composite scores, is flawed, and they do not always predict when a school is going to close. And students that might be thinking about that might be making their decisions based on incomplete or imperfect information out there. And so, yes, we absolutely shouldn't dismiss the role of personal responsibility, but I also believe there is a role for policy in terms of improving the information that's available to students and pushing the higher education system in the right direction.
But to that end, why is it my responsibility as a taxpayer to bail that institution out? Why not bail out failing into other industries of people? Why does it always fall on the taxpayer?
I agree with you that it shouldn't be the taxpayer's responsibility to bail out these institutions. Okay. That's why I've proposed that institutions be required to purchase insurance to make taxpayers whole. In the event. I
fully agree with you on that, because I think as a taxpayer who does their due diligence, I shouldn't be responsible for somebody else's. Where does that road end? Is I think the issue, and I like the idea of, instead of giving loans or forgiving the loans, maybe we should focus our effort, instead of putting the burden on the taxpayer, finding other resources to get students into other schools, because at the end of the day, that was their ultimate goal, right? Was to get an education of which they were defrauded on, or for whatever reason, let's say a bad institution, for example. That would be, to me, a much better use of our time, effort, energy, and resources, as opposed to burdening the taxpayers with paying their debt. Let's help them, and let's spend our time, effort, and energy on finding another school, as opposed to burdening the taxpayer. Would you agree with that synopsis?
I fully agree, yes.
Okay. With that, I yield back.
Thank you so much, Ms.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think we have exhausted our witnesses and our testimony and questions today. Is it anyone else? Okay. I remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, materials for submission for the hearing record must be submitted to the committee clerk within 14 days following the last day of the hearing. So by close of business on October 14, 2021, preferably in Microsoft Word format. The material submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. Only a member of the subcommittee or an invited witness may submit materials for inclusion in the hearing record. Documents are limited to 50 pages each. Documents longer than 50 pages will be incorporated into the record by way of the internet link, and that you must provide to the committee clerk within the required time frame. But please recognize that in the future, that link may no longer work. Pursuant to House rules and regulations, items for the record should be submitted to the clerk electronically by emailing submissions to edandlabor.hearings@mail.house.gov. Again, I want to thank all of the witnesses for their participation today. Members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for you, and we ask the witnesses to please respond to those questions in writing. The hearing record will be held open for 14 days in order to receive those responses. I remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, witness questions for the hearing record must be submitted to the majority committee staff or committee clerk within 7 days. The questions submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member for a closing statement. Dr. Murphy.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I just wanted to extend a thank you to the speakers who came and witnesses came today. I think we learned a great deal. We learned a lot, and I think there was a lot of common ground discussed. I will say, as someone who took out thousands of dollars of student loans myself to go to college and to medical school, I would be devastated if I showed up one day and the school was closed and I was left holding the bill. So I am truly empathetic with the cause that we are discussing here. But I want to return just to one issue that I think is something that the committee actually can find a great deal of bipartisan support for, and that was the issue about insurance. But I just want to make sure that everyone understands how insurance actually works. A comment made by one of my colleagues argued that the burden of purchasing insurance would fall equally on all institutions, including those with the likelihood, very little likelihood of closure, and that's factually correct. But then again, let's remember what insurance does. And I often fall back on my experience in medicine, and I apologize for this, but it's what I know best. As a physician, I am required, as are all physicians, to pay malpractice insurance. But the infinite majority of physicians do not have claims put against them. So while I may not ever have a claim put against me, I am still paying malpractice insurance. And so while it's very similar in this concept, that the function of a specific risk of an individual policyholder, which in this case is the individual school. And so they have to pay for some risk for others that are within the educational system for failure. Therefore, however, but in total contrast, the policies that we're talking about today, the ones which the Biden administration seeks to extend, places the entire burden of the student's debt on hardworking taxpayers, a significant number of which never went to college. And so I just want to make this distinction very, very clear. We have two different, very, very different paradigms. We have the tried and true method of insurance protection, or sadly enough, the often repeated policy of continuing placing burdens on taxpayers. And while it's important that students who are unable to complete their degree have protections, I believe there's consensus on this committee. It's equally important that we understand that taxpayers do as well. The proposal that was discussed today about insurance is one way of doing so. And this is why I really suggest that we work together in a bipartisan manner to reform the Higher Education Act and discuss this further. It is a proactive way of helping these students who have been left out in the cold. It's critical that we do this despite my colleagues' focus sometimes on a limited set of defunct proprietary claims, that policy experts agree that over the coming decades, we will see also another wave of school closures. So let's get this right now. This is not being just for-profit schools, but for everyone. So let us work together on a proactive way of dealing with this rather than just dumping things oftentimes, again, on taxpayers, most of which have no skin in this game. So let's talk about ensuring the students have the ability to complete their degree, which is the ultimate goal, and earn their credentialing that leads to a process of lifelong success. And that should be our number one priority. Burdening taxpayers further with other people's debt should be our last resort. Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you again, visitors, and I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. I now recognize myself for a closing statement. I want to thank all of the witnesses for your time today. You have just been exceptional. All of us have learned so much, and we take your testimony very, very seriously. So thank you for taking the time from your busy day to come before our Higher Education Committee and testifying. We appreciate it so much. I want to particularly thank the Government Accountability Office for sharing its preliminary findings with our committee. We really appreciate it. The GAO's examination of the closed school discharge process identified important challenges that the Education Department must address to support students affected by abrupt college closures. As our witnesses discussed, school closures are devastating to students, plunging them into financial and emotional despair while robbing them of the education and opportunities they deserve. As the Education Department and the negotiating committee began considering changes to the closed school discharge process, borrowers like Ms. Rhodes must be at the center of their discussions. The GAO's findings point to 3 clear steps that the Education Department can take to improve the closed school discharge process. First, restore the automatic school discharge process and streamline relief for students. Second, conduct better oversight of teach-out plans to help students complete their degrees. And third, crack down on predatory schools that are costing students and taxpayers billions of dollars. I look forward to working with the Education Department to better protect students and taxpayers affected by school closures, a majority of which are predatory colleges, including holding these owners and executives that defraud their students to take on personal responsibility for their actions. I look forward to hearing more from you as you answer questions that are submitted to you, and thank you again for being our witnesses today. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you so much.